Tantus Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue our discussion on the Pathfinder role-playing game system. We last left off, we were talking about special abilities, special things that your creatures, your players, can maybe have. We're finishing up today because we're finishing up our discussion on spell resistance. Then we'll move on from there to conditions. Last chapter we're going to talk about in this book. Now let's dive back into spell resistance, of course. Now spell resistance, generally under a spell's description, it will list whether spell resistance applies or not. That's the easiest way that you're going to tell if a spell has spell resistance. There are some other guidelines, especially when it comes to spells that might not have this information. If a spell targets you directly and you have spell resistance, your spell resistance will apply. Now this doesn't mean that if your spell would target multiple targets, that you and all those targets would be protected, your spell resistance would apply. But all the other targets of this same spell would still be affected by that spell. It only removes it from you. If you and some of the other targets have spell resistance, then I, as the original caster, have to check spell resistance for each of them individually. I check this one, and this one because they all have spell resistance. The other 3 or 4 or whatever number of targets affected normally because they didn't have it. Area spells are very similar to this. They fill an area. If I has spell resistance or in an area when I'm getting hit by it, my spell resistance is checked. If I'm overcome it, I'm not affected. But I still don't cancel the spell. The area is still hitting everything there. Creatures without spell resistance would still be hit. Other creatures with spell resistance would be checked just as normal. Most of the time, spells that create an effect, things that summon something or summon a creature, do not have spell resistance apply to them. Only should this effect be a direct kind of hit to the target, like for example the web spell. When you summon a web directly on a target, does spell resistance actually apply? But most of the time when I'm creating an effect, spell resistance won't be something we'll have to worry about. Now spell resistance can protect from a creature, from a spell that's already in effect. If I wander into an area of an ongoing effect that would have hit me as soon as I entered into it, so therefore spell resistance would apply, I get to have that check right then and there to see if it applies to me. I could possibly ignore that spell. The thing is that you get to check spell resistance once. Only once. If the spell resistance check is successful, every time I encounter that spell, I'm immune to that spell. Regardless if that area is ongoing and I leave it and then come back in, I have checked against it, had my resistance to that casting of the spell. The same could be said if I failed, or if the person overcame my spell resistance. So now, instead of failing to overcome my spell resistance, they successfully did. If I leave that area, and for some reason have to re-enter that area, I'm hit by that spell again because I'm already affected. You get one chance to overcome someone's spell resistance. And after that chance, it determines how that spell affects them, regardless of how many times they encounter it. Now, if I had lowered my spell resistance voluntarily, and get hit by a spell, as soon as I stop lowering my spell resistance, I get that one check, or I get that one attempt to resist that spell. The person still has to roll as soon as my spell resistance returns in order for me to be immune to the spell. So I could be hit by a spell and then be like, oh, my spell resistance comes back. I resist the continued effects of the spell. My resistance to it returns. In most cases, if a spell is affecting a target's mind or body in some way, it's going to have spell resistance. As I said, indirect effects, things that are happening to you indirectly, whether damaging you or affecting you, that's something that spell resistance will not apply to. Similarly, most of the time, spell resistance will not apply to a spell that's either tricking a target's senses or trying to glean some kind of details and information about them in some way. These are ones that traditionally spell resistance does not apply. Another thing is spells with an instantaneous duration. If the spell says instantaneous and has an effect that might be ongoing after that, I traditionally will not have spell resistance against that. If during that instantaneous duration I am directly targeted by something or directly affected by something, then those are more likely to have spell resistance apply against me, to protect me against this. Because though it's instantaneous, it's still a more direct target to me. Now let's move on and start to talk about conditions. Conditions are something that is traditionally negative that can come upon your character as a result of some kind of ability, effect, or attack of a creature. These conditions last a period of time, traditionally defined by whatever is causing it in the first place. It can be a number of rounds, minutes, it could be permanent. Each condition has their own unique abilities and effects that they have on your character. Traditionally, most conditions stack with each other, meaning that I can have a lot of conditions hitting me. But you can see sometimes between the conditions that they have very similar effects. They effectively are not stacking because they're doing the exact same thing to you, just one might be worse than the other. In this case, the worse effect applies, that I'm getting whatever is worse in this case hitting me, though technically both conditions are applied to me at the same time. Then we'd have to keep track of how long each are to see if perhaps one remains after the other. Let's dive into the conditions though, because we do want to talk about them to a degree. I'll try to keep these. So bleeding. Bleeding is an ongoing damage that is affecting your character, that at the beginning of your turn, you take this damage. This damage can take a number of forms. Physical damage to you, ability damage, and rarely it can be even ability drain. Traditionally, a heal check of DC 15 will stop the bleeding, or casting some kind of spell that will cure wounds, will heal wounds on the target, will effectively end the bleeding also. Though certain bleed effects will mention whether they have unique ways to end them. Bleed effects do not stack with each other if they deal the same type of damage, unless specifically mentioned by that bleeding source. So, if it doesn't say anything, they're not going to stack with each other. And this means that if it's dealing damage, won't stack with dealing damage. But I could have dealing damage and dealing ability damage to me, both types of bleed, at the same time, because they're dealing different types of damage. If you do get multiple bleed sources, the worst one is the one that is going to be applied, the worst one of them all. So if one does a d6, one does 2d6, 2d6 one is going to be applied. In this case, ability drain is worse than ability damage. So you won't get both of those at the same time. If I start getting drain, that one will supersede, will be the one that I'll be taking instead of the damage. Now, blinded. I can't see. Simple as that. I take a -2 penalty to AC. I can't use my dex bonus to AC. I take a -4 to most strength and dex-based skills, and a -4 to any kind of opposed perceptions. I automatically fail any kind of check or ability that requires vision to act out properly. And if I attack any opponents, they have total concealment against me. Now that's not even the last thing. You also can't move more than half your speed, or if you do, you must make a DC 10 acrobatics check or fall prone. You can't move quickly because you don't know what you're going to hit into, or when you're going to hit anything, and you'll just get knocked down. Now, it is very important to note that if you're blinded for a period of time, you can become adapted to it. Some of these penalties I've been talking about, you can begin to ignore and remove. The longer you are the blinded, the better are you with dealing with it. Some of them won't go away, but there are other ones that you can eventually mitigate by training yourself to be blind. Now, the last condition I want to talk about today is broken. Broken is a condition for items. It applies when they've taken 50% of their total health. Depending on the type of item, depends on the effects. Weapons get -2 to attack and damage, only critical on a 20, and only critical ×2, no matter what their critical and was before, range, or multiplication. Armor, you half the armor bonus you would have gotten from that armor, and armor check penalty that you'd have to, of course, skills, is doubled. So double the armor check penalty, half the AC bonus. If it's a specific tool for some kind of skill, you get -2 to using that skill. If it's a wand or a staff that uses charges, you use twice the amount of charges that you would have originally. If it has none of these things, it doesn't fill up any of these other ideas, no effect. The broken condition does not affect this item. So it has to fall under one of these categories or it's just broken. Now, there is still a disadvantage to a broken item. If you wish to sell it, you sell it at 75% of the price. Now, this doesn't mean you can't fix up a broken item, make it usable again. If your broken item is magical, you can use mending or make whole. The only thing here is you have to have a higher caster level than was used to create this magic item for this spell to successfully repair it. If it's a mundane item, these spells work automatically just fine, but you can also make craft checks in order to repair it. It would be craft DC 20, requiring an hour of work per hit point repaired. You could of course hire a craftsman to do this if you do not have the craft skill, and they will charge you 1/10 of the original cost of the item in order to repair it up to full hit points. But that's it for today. So I finished up with conditions with going over a little more details about how spell resistance work, a few more rules on when it's affecting you, when you might be checking against it, things like that. Then I dove into the conditions, going over 3 conditions today. Bleeding, when you're literally bleeding out, taking damage every turn, whether it's ability or physical. Blinded, you can't see, gotta deal with that. And of course broken, a condition specifically for items where they don't work as well. Most of the time. There are certain items that broken condition doesn't matter about. In the next episode, we are going to continue with conditions, because there are a bunch more conditions we want to talk about before we finish up our book on Pathfinder. We're almost done here, only a few more episodes left. But if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It's your support channel, the Empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you can always check out my Patreon. Link in the description below. There's some great rewards there. Helps to grow and improve the channel and the Empire. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.